Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Scrutiny Management Panel meeting. I'm Councillor Simon Bosher, Chair of this panel, and I would like to draw your attention to the following. Housekeeping. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the fire marshal regulations, if you signed into the Guildhall, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. Live streaming. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room, and the recording will be on the Council's website. The camera will mainly capture the backs of anybody making deputations, but there will be some footage of them as they approach and leave the table where the microphones are located, and of people entering or leaving the room whilst the meeting is in progress. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. May I ask everyone to use the microphones provided when they are speaking. And please can I ask members and officers to introduce themselves, starting to my, it says left here, but I've not got anybody to my left. So we'll start behind me.
Councillor Scott Peter-Harris.
Councillor Benedict Swan.
Councillor Stuart Brown.
Leo Madden, Councillor Nelson Ward.
Councillor Graham Heaney.
Councillor Robert St Thomas Ward.
James Harris, Senior Local Democracy Officer.
Chris Ward, Director of Finance.
Thank you very much. Agenda item 1, apologies for absence. None have been received to the best of my knowledge. Is that right, James?
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. Declarations of interest. Do members have any interests to declare? That will be none. We have 2 sets of meetings to go through, members, that we need to approve. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 29th of January 2021 and the special meeting held on the 15th of September 2021. Have those members that were present had an opportunity just to look through the minutes?
Could I just raise one point? Just a technical point, that's all. It's on the minutes of the 29th of January 2021. I didn't pick it up the first time, but I picked it up and I read them again this morning. This time last year we were in lockdown and we didn't meet in the civic offices. In fact, I checked up my diary, it was a remote meeting. Can we just make sure that, in case people come and accuse us of having parties on our own, we actually did not meet this time last year.
Very much, Councillor Madden. James, you duly noted that. Okay, with that minor amendment, can those members that were present, which would have been Councillor Madden, myself and Councillor Peter-Harris, are you happy that the meeting on the 29th of January, those minutes are now correct? With that amendment? Thank you. And the special meeting held on the, the 15th of September. Those present were myself, Councillor Brown, and Councillor Symes and Councillor Peter-Harris. Are we happy that they're a correct record? Thank you very much. Okay, we'll finish the meeting minutes. Welcome, Councillor Symes. Do you have any declarations of interest? No problem. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to agenda item 4. Presentation on Portsmouth City Council budget and council tax 2022-23 and the medium-term budget forecast for 23-24 and 25-26. And welcome to Chris Ward, who is going to provide an overview concentrating on the executive summary. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. Good afternoon, members. I just check the slide deck is up. Okay. So as you obviously are aware, we've got a the annual budget meeting coming up on the 15th of February, and this is to take you through all of the key aspects of the budget report, the recommendations to Council, and also to take a look ahead as well about what the future might look like in terms of the Council's funding position. So if I just start with some headlines, and these are really the aspects of the report that will be focused in the Council's resolutions and those things that you'll be asked to vote upon. So in accordance with the Council resolution from almost a year ago, the Council resolution at that point said that in coming to this budget round, that the Council ought to make £1 million worth of savings as a minimum. The proposals in the report that you have before you make £1.825 million worth of savings. That's obviously because there are some new spending proposals in here, so they are policy proposals from the administration, and therefore they had to identify further savings in order to fund their new spending initiatives. There are proposals within the report around the council tax and council tax setting, and the proposals are for a 2.99% increase in council tax. 1% of the 2.99, i.e. is to be directly for adult social care and is passported directly to that service for their spending needs. So it's 1.99% for general purposes and a further 1% for adult social care. The capital programme is put before you as well, and the new starts for next financial year, and the overall new capital investment proposed amounts to £67.8 million, and that's funded from a variety of sources, which we'll come to in the presentation itself. And finally, the look ahead. So the look ahead focuses on not the coming financial year, but the 3 years beyond that, and makes an assessment of what the expected financial position would be for each of the following 3 years. So each of the 3 years, 23-24, 24-25, and 25-26. The forecast for that whole 3-year period is that the Council's overall financial position is in balance. If that came to fruition over those 3 years, and obviously there's a number of assumptions and a number of uncertainties associated with that, then that would mean that the Council wouldn't have a minimum savings requirement for either of those 3 years. But as you'll hear me talk about further in the presentation, that forecast is subject to quite a lot of uncertainty, and the forecasts could reasonably vary by between plus or minus £3 million. That said, there is a resolution, or there is a proposed recommendation within the budget papers to say that for the year 23-24, no savings are required. So let's just remind ourselves of a little bit of context of where the Council has come from in recent years, and some context about the Council tax position as well, because the two main reasons for meeting obviously are to approve the budget and to approve the level of Council tax that supports the spending that's contained within the budget that will be before you. So you will know we've lived through this now for well over a decade, that the Council has had to make significant savings over the past period. Since 2011-12, it amounts to £104 million, which is almost half of the Council's controllable spending. Now that's arisen for two main factors. Firstly, there was the period of austerity, and there were funding reductions to local government across the country, but also every local authority, also upper tier local authorities in particular, have experienced the particular cost pressures associated with adults and children's social care. So a combination of factors have led the Council to have to seek savings of around £104 million. Now, when we talk about savings. Savings can come in a variety of forms. That could be efficiency savings, it could be additional income generated, or it could be service reductions. So the 104 covers all of those three categories. In terms of council tax, the Portsmouth City Council is a low taxing authority compared to our statistical neighbours. If we look across at our statistical unitary comparators, then the council levies a tax that's on average 10% less. If it was at the average, then the council would receive a further £9.3 million worth of council tax funding. Also, the council has what's described as a low council tax base. So you'll probably be aware that whenever council tax is spoken about in the national context, it's spoken about as Band D, because that's the average council tax band across the country. If we look at our Portsmouth residents, the average taxpayer is Band B. So in that sense, the amount of council tax that is raised locally, the majority of it is raised on Band B and not Band D, and therefore it's an overall lower level of council tax that is received by Portsmouth. There is some compensation for that through government funding, but it's not full compensation. The other piece of context that I think is important is, obviously for the past 2 years we've been operated in what we probably describe as a COVID environment. That's caused particular cost pressures on the council, but also significant income losses, particularly if we look at the commercial ferry port. That has had a significant influence on the budgets for the council over the past couple of years, and it will continue to have an influence as we go forward. The legacy of the pandemic will be with us, and we expect that to continue at least for the next 2 to 3 years at some level. And just to wrap up, I think in preparing the budget for 2022-23-4 that will be before you, the biggest challenge actually has been the combination of trying to accommodate everything associated with the impact of the pandemic, but at the same time the continuing pressures that are being experienced both in adults and children's social care. So you'll recall that if we go back and think about this from the top level, the council does have a financial strategy, and whilst it's set out in much more detail in the budget report, in overall terms, it's about getting to a position where your in-year expenditure is matched, or your in-year funding matches your in-year spending, so that you have what we might describe as structural balance to the overall financial position of the council. But that said, in achieving that, you would still want to have a focus in certain areas, and the adopted strategy for the council is one that has a focus around regeneration, being innovative, creative, and protecting the most vulnerable in society. In financial terms, you'll recall that what that means, or what that meant when we last looked at the overall what we last looked at in order to balance the overall financial position. When we were here this time last year, the forecast was that we needed to identify £3 million worth of savings over a 3-year period. This financial year, as I mentioned earlier, is the first of those 3 years, and that delivers the first £1 million of that £3 million deficit. But as I said up front in the headlines, we've now reviewed our forecast, and our forecast now looks at a balanced position over the next 3-year period. So it's a different time period, but it's moved on a year. So, but in contextual terms, the expectation was for the council to move towards finding £3 million over 3 years. So that just deals with some of the history. We've been living with a budget during the course of this year, so the budget that was approved last year. And at this time, it's the opportunity to do a full revision of the current year's budget. So, in terms of the current year, we've obviously prepared a revised budget for the current year, and it has a spending increase of 9%. Now, that's obviously quite substantial, but the main reasons for that they're mainly around government initiatives. So it's largely related to the business rate initiatives that the government have put in place during the year. So there's been the expanded retail and nursery discount, and and the other business rate initiative, which is abbreviated to be called the CARF scheme, which is the COVID Additional Restrictions Fund. So, Additional Relief Fund, sorry. So that's generally what's driven the increase in spending. So it's been fully recompensed by government. So it leaves it has a neutral impact on the council's overall budget, but it does exhibit itself as a 9% increase. Now, just some of the other things that are accommodated within the revised budget, and it starts to exemplify some of the particular implications of COVID in particular. So, within the revised budget, there are, and you'll probably have seen this through the monitoring reports that have come to Cabinet through the year in terms of budget monitoring. There's £10.6 million worth of additional COVID costs stroke income losses that the council has had to accommodate in the year. So this is over and above what you would expect in a normal budget. A lot of that has been driven by the losses of income at the commercial ferry port, but equally there are significant costs in particularly in children's social care, which is in around about 2 million, and also in adult social care. On top of that, there's forecast other budget pressures in children's social care of 2.4 million. That's accommodated within the revised budget, as are the other items listed there before you. Housing, in terms of additional pressures on temporary accommodation. Community safety and environment, that really relates to reductions in income associated with waste. There are some what we describe as windfall costs because of the nature of them. They're generally uncontrollable, and they're of a size that you wouldn't normally expect to be able to accommodate within a portfolio budget. So much of that has been housing benefit. Some of it obviously is related to the tower and the loss of sponsorship income. But the other feature of the revised budget is to make a revenue contribution to capital of £1 million. Now you'll see when I talk about the budget for next financial year that will be put before the council, there's a further £2 million proposed. So in total, £3 million worth of funding from the revenue budget is proposed to be added to the capital resources in order to fund the new starts that are proposed for next financial year. If we look at the overall impact and the overall impact on the council's financial position for the revised budget, it's broadly neutral, and the best test of that is to say what has been the impact in terms of the council's general reserves, because that's the extent to which you need to draw on when you need to be able to balance your spending with your funding, and it's an improvement of just 79,000. So it's broadly in balance overall. So if we now look to some of the key proposals that will be before the council on the 15th, this is the budget for next financial year. So just as some preface to that, the council obviously did, as it does each year, undertook a budget consultation. The budget consultation, I think, I can't remember exactly what the figures are now, but it was an improved response rate this time round compared to last time round. But the key questions were really the usual key questions around what are residents' preferences in terms of council tax increase, what are residents' priorities in terms of services, and what are residents' priorities in terms of any new capital expenditure around the city. So the question was in there around council tax, and 78% of respondents supported some level of council tax increase. The most popular response actually was a 2% rise. In terms of service priorities, so those services that residents value the most, collecting bins, keeping the city clean, ensuring older people and vulnerable adults are properly looked after, and supporting education, early years, and children with special educational needs. So they were the top three, and in that order. And when it came to capital investment priorities, and again in this order, building homes in the city, including flats for special care for the elderly residents, investing in greening projects, and creating better facilities for transport, including active travel areas such as cycling and walking. So obviously that's been received and has informed the budget proposals that will be before you on the 15th. And again, just some other background, because again, this is also an influence on the budget proposals that come forward, which is what came out of the local government finance settlement. Well, we haven't yet had the final settlement, and I think that's expected middle of next week. But the provisional settlement is always a good guide for what the final settlement will be. So if we look at the funding aspects of the settlement, hopefully you can see that. It's quite small on my screen. But you may recall that part of what's informed this local government settlement was the comprehensive spending review, which was undertaken in the autumn. And in the comprehensive spending review, there was quite a substantial increase in funding assigned to local government, and nationally to come direct to local government, it was about 1.6 billion. But irregularly, in a comprehensive spending review, that was flat. So there was no uplift beyond the first year's 1.6 billion in the following year or the year after that. So any uplift that's experienced this year is supposed to fund all new burdens, all budget pressures for the whole 3-year period, so that the settlement funding is front-loaded with no further uplift in that settlement anticipated for the years 23-4 or 24-5. So in terms of Portsmouth, there's a real increase of about £5.7 million, and it comes broadly in 2 strands. The first strand is an increase in the existing social care grant, and it's an increase of 2.5 million for obvious reasons, some of which I'll come on to later. And the other aspect of the increase is what's described as the new 2022-23 services grant, and I think that's got a deliberate description of 22-23 because government have said to us, you cannot rely on that going forward. That's not to say that it will come out of the local government funding system, because it will stay in the local government funding system, but government have been clear that that could be distributed differently in future years. So you cannot rely on receiving that 3.3 million in total in future years. It could be a greater amount or it could be a lesser amount. Pretty much all of the other elements of the local government funding settlement have been inflation linked. But as you'll be aware, whilst we say it's been inflation linked at the Consumer Price Index back in September, which was running at around 3.17%, I think it was, 3.2%. Inflation at the moment is tracking at about 5.4%. So actual inflation next year will be greater than 3.2%, and I think that's already widely recognised. That kind of deals with the like-for-like aspects of the finance settlement, but obviously we've got the new social care reform on the horizon, which is due to be implemented from October 23. So there is some preparatory funding that's provided within the settlement and it's entitled Market Sustainability and Fair Cost of Care Fund. And that's really about getting ready for the reforms that are due to come in October 23. So the money's got strings attached. It's not freely available to be spent. It's to be spent on particular aspects of the preparation for social care reform. If we move on to the announcements in the settlement relating to council tax, I'm sure you'll be aware of this, but let's call it the council tax limits. The council tax limits are 2% for a general increase for authorities such as Portsmouth. The further 1% for an adult social care precept if you've got adult social care responsibilities. It's a £10 limit for police and crime commissioners, and it's the higher of a £5 limit or 2% for fire and rescue authorities. Now, it's important for me to talk a little bit about the future, because I mentioned earlier that a couple of things in particular. One, I said that the 3.3 million of the new services grant is not guaranteed going forward, and this is all to do with what is described as well, there's two aspects to it, but it's an overhaul of local government funding. So it was originally due to be introduced this coming financial year, but it's been delayed a further year. And there's two aspects to it. There's what's described as the fair funding review. So that takes the existing, and I'll use this term loosely, but the existing settlement that we receive, which in the way that the government described this amounts to about just over £60 million. So it's going to say the £60 million that is currently, in one guise or another, allocated to this council will be distributed differently in the future. And we might be a winner and we might be a loser. But it's connected with the levelling up agenda. So part of the fair funding review is part of national government's intentions to level up across the country. So there's risk associated with 60.6 million in terms of that funding stream. There's also what's called the business rate retention scheme, and obviously you'll be aware that we retain 50% of all business rates that are generated within the city, and any growth on that business rates, we retain 50% of that as well. Currently, the council is enjoying £7.3 million worth of business rate growth. Now, the way that the business rate reset will work is, in the first instance, that 7.3 million will be taken away from Portsmouth. And then that 7.3 million will be aggregated with all other business rate growth across the country and redistributed through the mechanism that I just mentioned, the fair funding review, because the intention is that it's redistributed on the basis of need rather than on the basis of where it was generated. And again, we don't know whether the council will benefit from that or will not benefit from that. So it's just important to note at this stage, and this is one of the reasons why I said when we are looking forward at our future forecasts include this year. So our future forecasts are for 23-24, 24-25 and 25-26. This reform is due to come in the first year of that 3-year forecast. So that's the contextual stuff about the local government finance settlement. It explained how much additional funding the council has received, and it also explained what the limits are around any council tax changes for the coming year. So the council tax proposal before the council is that in overall terms, it's 2.99%, which is within the thresholds. That amounts in cash terms to £2.6 million overall. Now, as I said earlier on, 1% of that is for adult social care, so that their share of the 2.6 million is 0.9, and 0.9 million pounds therefore has to be passported direct to adult social care. The remaining 1.7 is available for general purposes. There's also our council tax receipts are up actually because of an increase in the council tax base. So that basically means we've got more council taxpayers paying council tax, and that amounts to about 1.1 million. And just so that you can see what this might mean to a Portsmouth resident, because obviously the council tax bill that lands on the door is not just the Portsmouth City Council element, it's also the fire element and the police element. We know that I think we know what the position is in terms of police. They were consulting, and I think that the police and crime panel they've also, what's the terminology, effectively accepted the proposal from the Police and Crime Commissioner for a £10 increase to their element of the council tax. And Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Authority are proposing the maximum that they're able to propose as well, which is £5. If we add all of those up, that would mean a 3.33% increase in council tax to a Portsmouth resident. So, if we look a little bit more closely at the budget proposal that will be before you on the 15th, as I said earlier on, there was a minimum requirement to find £1 million worth of savings. So there are proposals, and they're contained within Appendix C of the budget report. So there's a list of proposals to make £1 million worth of savings, but on top of that, a further £825,000 worth of savings are also included in Appendix C. And as I mentioned earlier on, that's to fund the new spending proposals that are also identified within the budget report. They relate largely to the full rollout of the food waste recycling service, but also to community wardens, climate change advisor, and also to embed the bulky waste service into the council's budget on an ongoing basis. Now, I talked just previously about the additional funding to local government from the settlement, which was 5.7 million. If we now contrast that with some of the spending proposals that are in the budget, and these largely are unavoidable spending cost pressures, there's a total of 9.6 million. So way in excess of the additional funding provided by government, and in large part they relate to adults and children's social care. The adults and children's social care combined amount to 7.2 million alone. 3.9 million in children's social care and 3.3 million in adult social care. Now, the drivers for each of those, the main drivers in terms of children's are to do with residential placements, they're to do with care leavers, and there's also monies allocated to them for previous year's savings that it is now known that are unachievable. And that's not something peculiar to Portsmouth. It was related to what's called the Mockingbird project. And when you look at studies across the country of local authorities that have implemented that type of arrangement, there have been no real cash savings associated with it, but there's lots of evidence to suggest that it's avoided significant additional cost. So there's funding in there to make sure that the children's social care budget remains robustly based. The 3.3 million for adult social care is largely driven by the 6.6% increase in the national living wage. So within that overall figure is obviously payments that the council will be obliged to make in terms of fee uplifts to its social care providers. So the majority of the 3.3 million is funding the 6.6% increase in the national living wage. If we then exclude adults and children's and say what is the cost of inflation to the rest of the council's activity, i.e. to be able to continue to perform steady state services, it's 1.7 million. And there are some other budget pressures are absolutely unavoidable within the proposal amounting to 0.7. That's just a flavour of some of the key financial pressures that are built into the budget proposal for next financial year. And the final thing to mention in terms of the budget proposal next year is the £2 million revenue contribution. So add that to the £1 million that I mentioned that has been provided for in the current year's budget, and it's a total of £3 million that is being provided to be able to fund or part fund the new capital proposals that are set aside, that are provided within the papers at Appendix D. If I summarise that very quickly, I won't say too much about this because I've gone over this in some depth on the previous slide, but on the expenditure side, you can see the items that I've just mentioned. Also probably important to note and to give you some comfort that the council has got good resilience within the budget proposal next year is that the council's contingency will be 18.6 million, but as I said, that covers all of the expected cost pressure, continuing cost pressures and income losses associated with COVID. And as I said earlier on, that's over 10 million in the current year. Funding increases, I've mentioned the 5.7, additional council tax 2.6. We do have a one-off surplus on the collection fund, so that relates to council tax received in the year of 1.8 million. And again, just to reiterate the point really, that whilst the settlement on the face of it is, it's not sufficient to cover all of the unavoidable cost pressures that are put forward as part of the budget, but there's risk associated with there's risk associated with the settlement going forward, and it's for the reasons that I mentioned before. And obviously we will also have to keep a watchful eye again on what the impact of COVID will be going forward, as well as adults and children's. So that takes us to the end of the budget proposal for the budget for next financial year, and on to what do we think the next 3 years might look like. I said right up front at the beginning of this presentation that we've got a balanced position over the forward 3-year projection, and this is just a fairly high level indication of how what's gone for the council in financial terms, those things that the council has to accommodate in financial terms, and how it all balances up to a balanced position in the centre. So if we look ahead forward and we make our assessments of inflation in order to continue to provide steady state services, and what's happening around pension costs, then the two combined amount to 9.4 million. That's over the full 3-year period. Again, if we make some assessment about what we think the additional costs associated with adults and children's social care might be over that period, our assessment at this stage is that it's 9.2 million. And that includes the forecasts for what is going to happen in the future around the national living wage as well. So it includes the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecasts for increases in the national living wage going forward. We're making an assumption that the overall impact on the council associated with that local government funding reform that I mentioned earlier, which was the fair funding review and the business rate reset, that may have a negative impact on the council to the tune of about £3 million, but largely informed by the fact that the council has enjoyed that business rate growth that will be taken away and then redistributed. On the plus side, business rates, we anticipate income from business rates to increase by 4.2 million over the period. That's largely just inflation-related increases as opposed to business rate growth. Again, council tax, we anticipate that council tax that council tax will increase by 2.99% each and every year for the following 3-year period. So the balanced forecast is predicated on council tax increases at 2.99%. And some technical matters about reduced contributions to reserves. A lot of this is really is a complicated matter. Some of it relates to the reductions in contributions to the capital programme. That's about half of it. The others are technical matters that really relate to what's happened in terms of these government business rate initiatives, where we've been fully compensated, but they're in the budget for the current year, but they're not in the budget for latter years. Like I said before, there's risks associated with that, and that forecast could change by plus or minus 3 million, and is one of the reasons why it's a rolling forecast, and this time next year we'll revisit the overall forecast to see that we continue to be in a balanced position, or what that position looks like, and then that will inform future years, any savings that are required for future years, if any. So moving to the capital programme, I won't dwell too much on the strategy. There's a little bit of strategy set out in the report, but obviously, as you would expect, one of the first priorities of any strategy in terms of any spending is to meet your statutory obligations. So that's part of a strategy, but there's also emphasis within the strategy around the economy, the environment, and public service transformation, i.e. efficiency savings. Whilst the overall capital investment proposed is 67.8 million, the resources available, the local resources available to fund that are just over 50 million. So the difference between the two being external grants usually. Of that, there's what we describe as almost I don't want to call it free resources, but free from terms and conditions resources of 13.3 million. There's proposed borrowing, but obviously subject to business case and proper financial appraisal, of 36.5 million. And there's contributions from reserves, this is mainly the port actually, of £1 million. So in overall terms, it's around about £50.8 million worth of resources from the council. As I said, the difference between that and the capital investment proposals itself is largely external grants. If you've had the opportunity to look through the new capital investment proposals, and they are, like I said earlier on, they're in Appendix D. So the new proposals, a lot of it is focused on our statutory responsibilities around health and safety and repairs and maintenance. So you'll see a lot of expenditure within those proposals that relate to, I call it administrative buildings, you will probably know it better as landlords, repairs and maintenance, theatres, the water sports centre, children's homes, the round tower, industrial estates, new roofs, for example, and the port itself. So there's a substantial amount of that overall sum that is targeted towards those types of expenditure. And then there are some specific investments outside of that, obviously, or in addition to that. The largest of which is the commercial port. And again, this will all be drawn down on the basis of a satisfactory business case. So there's £27.5 million worth of proposed spending at the commercial port, but that's mainly for their master plan, and some of you will have probably attended the sessions that have been run by Mike Sellers talking about port master plan and land requirements in order to deliver against the port master plan. But just like any commercial business, it's got to be viable, and if the council is to borrow for that, it needs to be able to fund the debt repayments from additional port revenues. So that's the lion's share of the new specific investments, but there's also investment in there in terms of replacement of the waste vehicle fleet. There's additional funding in there for, let's call it Bransbury Park. There's money in there for digital infrastructure, and there's quite a lot of extra money that is provided by government as part of that. And the usual spend around transport, and there's also some money in there for football facilities. I often use this slide at the end just to remind members that whilst it might appear that we are spending quite considerable amounts of money on new capital investment, in terms of that free to use money, which I described on the previous slide of 13.3 million, historically it hovers around that kind of level. Prior years it's been up at 15-16 million pounds, and that's because as a council you've been making revenue contributions to the capital programme. If you said to me, what is the routine amount of money that you usually receive outside of revenue contributions, it's about 7 million a year. Now, that's really quite a small amount of money when you compare that to the type of spending that routinely the council has been making for its absolute essential capital needs. So I say this because it's actually an important part, or has been an important part of the council's strategy in previous years to make revenue contributions to capital, because our capital investment needs will always outstrip the funding that is available for capital. And of that 7 million, much of it has some level of strings attached to it. Some of it will be for school maintenance, for example. Some of it will be for disabled facilities grants, and so there's a passporting element to large amounts of that 7 million. So you really get to a really small amount of free to use, if you like, capital funding. So revenue contribution should always be an important part of your strategy if we want to sustain a level of capital investment. So just to sum up, the budget proposal, it meets the council resolution of February 2021 to achieve a minimum of £1 million worth of revenue savings. It's a balanced budget. It sits nicely with the council's medium-term financial strategy, and you can see the relationship between the budget proposal and the budget consultation, the results of the budget consultation. As I've said, the key issues in seeking to balance this budget have been around the pandemic, as well as the pressures in adults and children's social care. A word of warning that future funding to the council is really quite uncertain, but that said, the council's overall financial position is sound and should be able to accommodate in the short term any negative impacts associated with that future uncertainty. And that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think members will agree that was a pretty concise overview of the budget position, and delivered in a way that I think we all can understand. Members, any questions or comments? Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Chair. Great presentation, Chris. I'm just trying to get a feel for the uncertainty. You did a balanced diagram of the next 3 years, where you have plus and minus that basically balanced up. And then there are factors. So, for instance, just this year, we hear that potentially they're going to give back money as part of the collecting the council tax. So there are factors that come in. Just want to get a feel for when you say there's a big uncertainty. Before people would say with a certain amount of certainty or stuff like that. So I'm just trying to understand that uncertainty and how you're going to handle things that come out of the woodwork, like the payback from the council rate for the heating.
Well, fortunately, the recent announcement about the £150 refund for all of those council taxpayers that are in bands A to D, the government will fund that. So that has a neutral effect on the council's financial position, in the same way that the government have funded all of the business rate reliefs that they've put forward over the past couple of years. In terms of looking forward, you're right. The level of uncertainty is quite significant. I mentioned two figures. There's uncertainty around the £60 million plus, which is what we receive effectively through the local government settlement, and that will be redistributed in a different way from 2013-14. And whilst that's the larger number, I would probably suggest that that's the lower of the two in terms of volatility. The other one is the loss of the business rate growth of 7.3 million. That's probably more at risk, I would suggest. We can take some comfort, I think, from the consultations that have been put before us previously for these two changes in terms of local government funding reform, in that in all of those consultations, government have talked about a transition period. So even in the event that, for example, it is quite, let's just say it's quite bad for the council, and let's just pick a figure out of the air and say it's £10 million negative. Make the numbers easy. £9 million negative. The government will probably say we need to phase that in over a 2 to 3 year period. So it might be 3 million in the first year, a further 3 million the second year, a further 3 million the third year. I think the way that the council's finances are in terms of its general level of reserves, it could accommodate fluctuations and have time to respond. So the council's finances are such that it should never be in a position where it has to have a big spike in savings in any one year, so it can always be managed over a reasonable period of time.
Councillor Madden, to adjudicate.
Thank you. Chris, thanks very much for that erudite and professional presentation, as always. I think my questions are slightly amateurish, so you'll bear with me, will you? On the council tax proposals 22, 20, and I actually don't know the answers to these, and I've certainly not been political. I thought I should say that from the start. I'm really interested in the budget here. When it comes, so we're 2.99 increase. You've shown that, right? Yeah. The police commissioner offers 4.42. The fire authority 7.10. Does that mean that only local authorities can only levy up to the 2%? And then beyond that, so in effect, the police commissioner or the fire authority can actually go for more if they so wish to do.
If I scroll back, the council's limit is 2% for general purposes. Yeah. It's a further 1% for adult social care. Yeah. But the other two, Hampshire Police and Crime Commissioner, all police and crime commissioners can have a maximum increase of £10. Oh, and if we added £10, which is the proposal, if you added £10 to what they currently precept, it's 4.42%. Okay. And equally for fire, and this is new actually for this year, I've not seen this before, fire have now got a maximum increase of £5 on their previous year's levy, and for our Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fire Authority, £5 equates to 7.1%. So their limits are in pounds as opposed to percentages, whereas the council's limit is a percentage limit.
Okay, can I carry on with a few more? Thank you. Can I assume, Chris, that any pay settlement for our staff this year and of course national insurance is included in all this?
Yes, it is. We've obviously had to make estimates of what we think the pay settlement might be, but we've also included the increase in the national insurance contributions that both employers and employees have to pay at 1.25%. Yes, so that's all included in the budget proposal.
On one of the slides, COVID, and my understanding is that all COVID expenditure would be repaid. I couldn't understand that bit, Chris, because it shows a loss as well, or a gain, or whatever. 10.6 million. Does that mean we're owed 10.6 million? No, well, what does it mean? You're right, Councillor Madden. It's a little bit confusing in the budget report. So what has happened is that, let's take this year just this year as an example. In this year, the amount of money that the council was given for COVID, I think, is 9.1 million. I think that's what I've mentioned in the budget report. But our costs will be more than that. Our costs are over 10 million. So we won't get any more, and the council has to pick up that difference. But what the council prudently did last year was basically set aside a fighting fund for COVID, because we were in the position where we knew that we were experiencing COVID costs, but we didn't know how much financial support we'd receive from government. So the council, from its own funds, set aside quite a significant amount of money. And we've carried that forward into this year and into future years to effectively be our COVID fighting fund, or our COVID contingency. So we've got the funds set aside for COVID, but much of it has been from the council's funds, and some of it has been from government funds. So I think the main point to get across is that it's not fully funded by government. Yeah, just on the inflation. And I think if we were allowed 4% for this year and then whatever it was for the years beyond this. I was just reading, I think yesterday, that the expectation for the autumn is 7.5% for inflation. So have we, and if it hits that, and therefore expenditure presumably would need to be cut? That's the first question. And I just feel my last one, if that's all right. We had DILNOT's report many, many years back, and I went to many a conference over DILNOT. But the government, to be fair, have given a commitment to do something about people going into residential accommodation and a limit on what should be paid. I know that it's not the long grass as previous governments had done. It's actually sitting there, I think, on the green, or whatever an expression might be. What would the impact, have we worked out what the impact of that might be for us? Because presumably it would cost us more, Chris, so we'd have to put more money in the fund, which may not come from central government.
Okay, on the inflation point, we've provided on average 4% for next year. As you'll know, a large chunk of our inflation is pay, which we don't anticipate being up at that kind of level, but we have accommodated within our forecast, within the budget for next year, some of that exceptional inflation. So there's exceptional inflation around gas and electricity, so which is really, really high. Some of which is 100%. But on average, our inflation provision for next year amounts to 4%. So if arguably, you could say, for argument's sake, 70% of our inflation is related to pay, and that could be 70% is 2% inflation, if you like, and 30% is a much higher level of inflation, but on average it works out at 4%. In the event that inflation turns out to be higher than what we've provided, we would look to the council's contingency, because that's where we look to cover all of the council's risks in year. So we obviously have a contingency provision, but it's to cover all risks. So we would cover it in year from the council's contingency, and then if it was to endure, that's when we would seek to build it into future years' budgets and future years' savings requirements. And in the interim period, if we've got a mismatch between our spending and our funding, that's why we've got general reserves that we can draw on in that interim period to smooth out the position between spending and funding. And then we're into making the savings again that we do on a forward-looking basis. So that's how we try to accommodate it. The main reason for that, Councillor Madden, is that it gives the council a stable planning framework, and so for every individual change that happens to the council's finances, we don't have to keep revisiting the overall position and say, well, that's happened now, so the savings requirement's gone up. Something else has happened, so that takes the savings requirement down, and so on and so forth. And it just gives us a way to be able to manage services in a balanced fashion. In terms of DILNOT, I think the social care reform is similar to obviously to the DILNOT report, and you'll know that better than I will, because I think you were probably cabinet member at the time that the DILNOT review took place. So we actually don't know the financial impact on the council, but what I mentioned in the slide that related to the this slide actually, that related to the funding in the settlement, there's £0.6 million has been allocated to Portsmouth for this financial year for what is termed Market Sustainability and Fair Cost of Care Fund. That's supposed to be the funding that the council receives to try to work out what the financial impact will be. So it's about seeking to work out what should care providers be paid. It's seeking to work out the extent to which current self-funders, for example, will want to lock into local authority care arrangements as opposed to their self-funded care arrangements. And so there's £600,000 provided for the local authority to start to do all of that work. So, as I said before, the implementation of the social care reform is October 23. So this is all the preparatory work to work out what the financial impact will be. And the government, separate from all of the figures that I've mentioned, have provided, from memory, 3.6 billion, I think, for the impact of the social care reform, which they haven't allocated to us yet, but is in the comprehensive spending review envelope and will, I think, be distributed once central government starts to receive all of the results from this piece of investigative work that will start to take place this year.
Chris, I've just got one question, which is a follow-on from the question that Councillor Madden asked about inflation. Because clearly, as you said, inflationary pressures, if inflation goes up, we will take it from contingency in year. At what sort of level, if inflation does rise and maintains a position, would you deem that the £1 million savings per annum that you're forecasting, which are currently based on the current levels, would have to be revisited?
I don't anticipate, I think that when it comes to the council resolution for next year and the £1 million, that's fixed. I don't anticipate an eventuality during the year where that £1 million would have to be revisited. The council ought to be able to cover that from its overall corporate contingency. If not, then the council does have sufficient general reserves to fall back on if it had to. It will be the following: if something exceptional happens, then I would have to bring a report probably around November, December time to revisit the forecast for next year and say, whilst the council has resolved to not make any savings for 23-24, so not the coming financial year, but for 23-24, something exceptional has happened. But I think it would have to be a combination of factors. I think it would have to be a really pessimistic result from local government funding reform, as well as something related to exceptional inflation. I'd be very surprised if I had to do that during the course of next year.
Very brave comment to make on live stream. Is there any other questions, members? Councillor Heaney.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, well, two, possibly three questions, and then I have a process question, which is not so much about the budget, but about the process. In the budget papers, and I think you mentioned it as well, about this one-off surplus on council tax collection funds, I think you indicated that we've got more people paying council tax, i.e. more properties. But is that the only reason for the surplus? I just want to understand where that has come from. Is that people like arrears being picked up more regularly? You know, people haven't paid now paying. What makes up that 1.1 million one-off surplus?
Yeah, the one-off surplus is 1.8 million, but the improvement in the tax base is 1.1 million. So, and the explanation is related actually. So, when the budget was set last year, we were anticipating that the economic impact of the pandemic would be more significant than it actually was. So we were anticipating that caseloads for local council tax support would rise quite significantly. The caseloads on local council tax support have been relatively flat actually. So when we set the budget last year, we set it at what we call a council tax base that accommodated increased caseloads for local council tax support. In the event that increased caseload didn't materialise, so it meant that our estimate of what we thought we'd get in council tax was actually lower than what actually happened. So that's one of the main drivers for the surplus. That's carried into our estimates for the tax base for next year. So in the budget proposals, you'll see that the tax base has increased, and it's largely because the previous tax base assumed lower levels of local council tax support caseload, but it's actually come back to our normal levels of council tax support. So it means that the council tax, it sounds like it's a council tax income increase, but it's only an increase on the previous year, which was a decrease. So it's returned to an ordinary plateau.
The second question, I think you've partly answered it in some of the things you've said already, but I'm puzzling a bit about this future years savings, which we always talk about when we do the budget, having to find potential savings in future years, particularly in the following 3 years. Now, you basically said, as far as I understand it, that we actually don't need to make any provision for savings in the next 2 years, except this year, obviously we do, but the following 2 years, because you think that the financial settlement that the government are going to give on local authority funding, plus all the other things about business around it, will actually deal with any potential problem we might have with the budget. Because you'd obviously thought about what might be our problem in years 2 and 3, and therefore you thought it might be about £1 million, but of course we're still uncertain. So is that a correct assumption that I'm making, that we have really lost any need for those £1 million savings in future years, notwithstanding the uncertainties you've already mentioned? Because I'm concerned that I've already seen stuff being publicised saying, oh, we're not going to have to make any savings next year. Well, actually, we might have to. And telling everyone we don't have to make any savings might be a bit premature.
I still feel confident that the council won't need to make any savings in 2023-24. And I think it's important that we stay with the stable planning environment that we've always had. I think that's helpful for the council, and it's helpful for council services. Something, like I say, something drastic would have to happen with local government finance reform, or something drastic around inflation, or something drastic around the council's cost base would probably have to happen for the council to have to revert to a savings programme for 23-24. This time next year, you can imagine how many variables there are in preparing a forecast for a council of this size, and that is a multifunctional organisation. This time next year, we'll do the same thing as we always do. We'll revise every single assumption that we have. And obviously there's some crystal ball gazing involved in that. So we'll revise every single assumption around inflation, every assumption around interest rates, every assumption around what we think might happen to adults and children's social care, the national living wage, what do we think is going to happen to business rates and business rate growth, what do we think will happen to collection rates, what do we think is going to happen to the number of council taxpayers, the number of new properties, the number of single person discounts, the number of exemptions, so there's a lot in it that can change. There'll be a triennial review of the pension fund, for example, and that may cause a change. So in all of this, it's the whole reason why we do a rolling 3-year forecast, so that we've always got the opportunity to adjust in good time, but also at the same time maintain the council's even approach to how it has to either make savings or not, as the case may be. I'm not sure if I've answered the question entirely. What I would say is the reason for the balanced projection is not one factor alone. So it's not the local government finance settlement, for example, because the local government finance settlement for next year doesn't even cover the additional costs on adults and children's social care, never mind anything else. But some things that have gone for the council compared to when we did this exercise last year are our assumptions on what we think our future pension obligations will be, for example, because the pension fund is in a healthy state. So it's some of those things that are genuinely outside of our control that have worked for us and can work for us, but equally can go the other way. And as I say, is the reason why we need to do regular comprehensive reviews of the overall forecast.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's okay. I get a sense that it's a multiple factor issue, so I feel a bit more reassured about that. The final budget question I have is related to a particular item in the savings, and the last question I wanted to ask was a process question. So I think if anyone's got a budget question, I'm happy to put my process question later at the end, because it's not really about the budget but about the process we go through. The final question relates to one of the savings what's been identified in the budget on page 132, which is about a governance review, which says it's going to save £30,000 a year. Can you tell me anything about what that might be? Because it's not very clear what a governance review would be. It doesn't specify. It just says no impact on service users.
Yeah, in very broad terms, it's a bit of a reorganisation between democratic services and legal services. So it's to bring that kind of legal and democratic function together. They work so closely together, as you can imagine, and it's more about a reorganisation of the function.
Do you have any more questions, Councillor Heaney?
If no one's got any budget, it's a process question actually, because I was looking at the Constitution and what it says about the budget and policy framework procedure rules. And what it says, and of course the budget is part of the policy framework, it's not the only thing, but it's an important part of it, because there are strategies as well which cover that. It says that the Executive will publicise, by including the forward plan and publicising at the Council's offices, a timetable making the proposals. Well, that went into the forward plan, which I saw in the beginning of December. It said that procedure would be. And it also says that arrangements of consultation, etc. And it also says the chairs of policy and view panels will also be notified, which is interesting, because I don't know whether they have, and then it says the executive would ask, should ask, the oversight panel, the performance panel, as appropriate, to look at particular issues and bring forward recommendations for consideration to help the development of the budget and policy framework. And then it talks about the executive drawing up firm proposals. Now, I'm not sure we do that, and I'm not sure we've done it on this round, and I can't recall doing it in the last 2 years. Can anybody give me any sort of sense of, are we following that process or not?
I think I can help a little bit with the language, because the budget and policy framework is not the budget, if that makes sense. The budget and policy framework is the overall budget, but it's also almost about every major policy and strategy. So that's what it's a global term for a big subject area. The budget and policy framework is not this budget report, as it were. So there's a distinction between the two. I don't know if that helps at all.
Well, I sort of recognise that in my preamble, and I said the budget is not just the only thing, it's the budget and policy framework that includes strategies as well. But it does say there is a procedure for or a process for developing the framework, which is set out in our constitution. And even when it comes to council strategies, I'm not sure that we actually do that, which is we inform relevant policy panel chairs, and when the executive does ask a relevant scrutiny panel for any views on a developing strategy. And I'm just wondering whether we either need to do that, because it says that's what we do in the procedures, or whether we need to change the procedures, because there's no point in having a procedure which we set out in the Constitution says we're doing it, and we don't do it. If it doesn't work, or it's not a process that people feel is appropriate, we maybe ought to change the rules.
I don't know that I've got a procedural answer to that, but I think it's within the gift of those scrutiny and oversight panels to input into strategies that are being developed. I think it partly depends on how you set your work agenda for the forthcoming year, and what it is those particular scrutiny panels would like to be involved in over the course of the year. I think that's the opportunity.
If I can just come back, I mean, the forward plan does alert you to strategies that are going to be decided upon, but it doesn't actually do anything more than that, because it seems to me that there's maybe a bit of action in between time where scrutiny panel, I mean, it seems it's left to the scrutiny panel chairs to make up their mind whether they want to do anything on that or not. And maybe we're missing something there about whether, because I'm sure members are busy, particularly some members who work, that being able to keep track of all this stuff is quite difficult, and maybe there should be some opportunities offered for that process to take place, should panels wish to take them up. I mean, they may decide not to, they may decide they've already reviewed something, but I'm just thinking that maybe there's something we could do there around helping scrutiny to have more of a role in shaping plans and policies that we might want to think about. I mean, it's not really, that's why I said this is a process issue rather than a budget issue, but it's something I've been thinking about in relation to this, and I just wanted to sort of bring that up as an issue, because in a sense it does affect scrutiny management and the way we do things, and I'm just sort of throwing that question out there for people to think about rather than having a solution.
Thank you very much, Councillor Heaney. Probably if I could help a little bit on that, the language that you looked at smacks very much of 15 years ago, and I'm sort of looking at Councillor Madden a bit here, when we did have two policy and review committees. One was a performance one, and the other one, the name completely escapes me. But we sort of do, and it may well be that the Constitution needs a little bit of tidying up to bring it up to date. Because part of the reason why the budget comes to scrutiny management and we have this special meeting is so that members can actually feed in and make comments with regards to the budget, which is sort of feeding into that process, albeit probably not as robustly as you'd like it to be. And of course, when you look at the budget framework and the finance on a wider scale, there are, and I don't sit on it now, a lot of reports that do go into governance and audit and standards that follow those sorts of things before they go to full council. And a lot of those reports are noting reports because they're going to go to Cabinet or full Council, but by the same token, certainly I can remember several, certainly in the days of Councillor Ian Lyon, for those that remember him, where we did actually put some recommendations through. But it may well be that the Constitution needs a bit of a tidy up to make it, to enhance a little bit of clarity in what we're actually doing. But I appreciate that there is, and of course we do get reports that do go to full council. Some might argue that that probably isn't the arena to discuss those reports, but by the same token, most of those reports tend to just get nodded through because everybody's in a rush to get onto the political notices of motion and the irrelevant questions, but we are where we are. Anyway, I'm not aware, sorry, yes, Councillor.
No, I just agree with, follow up your, Graham and yourself were saying. I mean, I'm the current chair of Governance and Audit. Quite happy to look at that, because I hadn't, and I've been clearing off the Constitution bit, so I don't recall clearing that one off, but I think it's something worth looking at, and process, I have to agree with Graham, is very important. If we're going to say we're going to do something. So it may be there's historical things we need to look at and perhaps take out of that consultation bit. Whatever happens, any amendments to the Constitution anyway, once we've looked at it, we'll come back to Council.
Thank you, Councillor Heaney. Right. No, I didn't. I apologise, Councillor Madden. You are very similar sat there. Members, there's no formal decision that's for the panel to take. However, we may forward any collective comments that we have as a panel to the Cabinet. With regards to the specific budget, I've not heard any comments that I think need to be put forward to the Cabinet. We just had a conversation around the process, whatever. I would suggest that this isn't the forum where we put that forward to the Cabinet, because we have the Chair of Governance and Audit and Standards with us, and if he's going to undertake to look at that, I think that is probably the right thing to do if we allow Councillor Madden to take that away. So with regards to the report, it's a noting report without any collective comments to go forward. All members of the committee agreed with that approach? That would appear to be unanimous. Many thanks. Okay, thank you, members. Well, that concludes today's meeting. Many thanks to Mr. Ward for what has been a very eloquent presentation, and I think fair enough with a lot of the answers he's given have been very full and informative as well. Okay, and I declare the meeting closed at 3:52. Many thanks.